Everyone knows the legend of the 300 Spartans who held off a Persian army of many thousands. The American Mafia also had its own 300 Spartans, and their name was the Gallo Brothers. Larry, Joe, and Albert gathered a loyal crew around them in the late 1950s and challenged their family bosses several times. They declared war to get the best terms for themselves and occupied their own Thermopylae pass in Brooklyn, from where they repelled superior forces. Of course, unlike the Spartans, they weren't defending their own country. They just wanted a bigger piece of the illegal business, but the analogy describes very well what went on back then. The Gallos are probably the most famous rebels in Cosa Nostra. They defied the authority of their bosses, defied the rules of the Mafia, recruited people of all nationalities into their brigade. They had a dwarf and a wild lion on their team, and defied the established shot callers, not allowing anyone to be considered better than themselves. No wonder they were once called the sixth family of the New York Mafia. So, if you're interested in hearing how a small criminal crew managed to stand up to the American Mafia at the height of its influence, then meet the Gallo Brothers on the other side of the law. The brothers were born just as the American Mafia was completing its formation. Larry, the eldest, was born in 1927, Joe in 1929, and Albert in 1930. The Gallo's father, named Umberto, came to the States in the early 1920s and made a small fortune in bootlegging, which he invested in a Brooklyn diner after Prohibition ended, and used for an underground loan shark operation. The brothers' mother, Mary, was seen as the main restraining force in the family, keeping her boys from going completely wild. Did she succeed? More likely no than yes. From an early age, the brothers were prone to antisocial behavior. Despite their small size, their height was a little over 5'7", they were constantly getting into fights, and Joe in particular became known as crazy, seeming to specifically seek out conflict with the big guys for them to prove their strength. Larry naturally took over the leadership of the trio. Everyone around recognized that he was the smartest and most sensible of the brothers. Joe was considered the toughest and most unstable among them. Albert was the youngest. No one attributes any special traits to him. Their criminal path as Mafia brothers began after getting acquainted with a member of the Profaci family, Johnny Otto, who led them to Frankie Abbatemarco, nicknamed Shots. Frankie was the captain of the Profaci family, tracing his criminal activity in Brooklyn back to the days of Frankie Yale. Shots ran an underground lottery there known as the Numbers Game. His net annual income was believed to be about $2.5 million. The Gallos began moonlighting as enforcers for Shots. It's believed that the brothers were only accepted into the Profaci family after they participated in the murder of Albert Anastasia. However, there's very little evidence for this. Most of the support for this version are half-joking hints by Joe Gallo about the involvement. However, there's another version where the proof is from the testimony of an informant immersed in the events. According to this version, the murder of Anastasia was the result of his conflict with his captains, Joe Biondo, Charles D'Angara, and Joseph Riccobene, who killed him, and then Carlo Gambino was put as the head of the family. And honestly, this version sounds extremely convincing. The three captains learned that they were going to be killed, went ahead and organized the assassination attempt first, and then obtained a pardon before the commission. Vito Genovese and Tommy Lucchese took advantage of this and lobbied for boss Carlo Gambino. And it should be said, this version completely changes the view of the end of Anastasia's life. You can see more about it in the video links I've left in the description. But even if we reject the Gallo brothers' participation in the hit on Anastasia, they were still accepted into the Profaci family in the late 1950s. Only Larry and Joe, though, since Albert wouldn't be a member of the Mafia for a while. And Joe had to suffer a little before he was approved. Like I said, he was considered crazy when he was a kid. Nothing changed when he grew up. They even called him Crazy Joe Gallo. He was short-tempered and almost uncontrollable, which made the Mafia believe that he was hooked on drugs. To prove otherwise, they locked Joe in a room with his consent because they wanted to see if he would have withdrawals or not. Joe didn't go into withdrawal, and so everyone was convinced that he was just mad. Later in prison, doctors would examine him, and it turned out that it wasn't just a nickname. Joe was actually suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. The mafia membership that Joe and Larry received raised their status in the organization, but had very little effect on their earnings. The basis for them was still extortion, protection, and jukeboxes. The latter consisted of the Gallo Brothers forcing establishments to buy jukeboxes from them, as well as organizing a union where they forced other jukebox distributors to join in order to make money from union fees. And it was because of their involvement in this type of racket that they were summoned to Senate hearings, where we get the famous video of Joe sitting in dark glasses and smoking a cigarette, answering dozens of questions with the same phrase falling back on the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. I respectfully decline to answer, because I firmly believe that my answer may incriminate me. Subsequently, to the Gallos' earnings would be added the sale of cigarette machines and pinball machines, gambling, extortion, music, and porn. As for the penultimate source, the most famous singer associated with the brothers was Jimmy Rosselli. At the time, he was competing with Sinatra for the right to be considered the best Italian-American singer. For the latter source, the Gallos were in the business of distributing pornographic magazines through their firm Astro News Distributors. If you like the Sammy Gravano podcast, you know that something similar was done by the Gambino family capo, Robert Di Bernardo. However, making money isn't the key to the Gallo brothers' story at all. The key, of course, was the wars they waged. And it is these I propose to pass on, having previously talked about the Gallo team, so that you have an idea of who dared to challenge the established system along with the brothers. The most colorful was, of course, the little man, Armando Iliano, nicknamed Mondo, who ran a bar, also called Mondo, where the Gallo brothers often hung out. In the basement of the same bar, Joe kept a lion that was often used to intimidate in extortion or ratting. At first, Joe just mostly wanted to bring some exotic animal to the bar to add to its charm. The first one was a monkey, but it became too much of a problem because it was trashing the place and throwing its shit around. Joe gave it back to the owner of the exotic animal store, and in return he offered him a lion cub. So the Gallo brothers had their own lion, which they set up a place for in the basement. After hearing all this, just try to say that the little gangster who keeps a lion in his basement is not a colorful figure of this gang. And in principle, the Gallo brothers' squad was very different from other mafia gangs. Where else in a team of mafiosi would you see an Arab, Ali Hassan Wafa, nicknamed Ali Baba, two Syrians, both nicknamed the Syrian, whose names were Louis Ubla and Sami Zar Albam, and a Greek guy named Pete Diopoulos. The core, however, was still made up of Italians. In 1961, Gallo and the team got involved in a war against his boss, Joe Profaci. In general, the conflict had been brewing for a long time, and the brothers were dissatisfied with the way the family distributed racketeering, and that they, as they say, got only crumbs from under the table. They did not hide their dissatisfaction, but nothing changed year after year. The trigger that made them take decisive action was the murder of Frankie Schatz, and there are several interpretations of why and how he was killed. In the first, the Gallos got Schatz to stop giving his boss a percentage of his earnings and come over to their side in an unspoken conflict. Profaci didn't like this and killed Frankie. In revenge and a desire for Schatz' racketeering business, the Gallos opted for aggravation. In the second version, Profaci himself came to the Gallos asking them to kill Frankie because he had stopped paying and was keeping a low profile. In return, the brothers were supposed to get Schatz' racketeering money, but Profaci tricked them and gave Frankie's enterprises to other people, causing the Gallos to escalate. The third version, however, differs from the first only in that the Gallos did not make the hit themselves, but passed its fulfillment to other people. But in any case, the reason for the escalation of the conflict was the murder of Frankie Schatz, and the question of who would take over his racketeering. It all began in early 1961 when the Gallos kidnapped people close to Profaci, specifically Joe Columbo, John Simone, Joseph Magliocco, and Sally Musacchio. It was planned that Profaci would also be among them, but this did not materialize. Larry's plan was to take action in order to have a stronger bargaining position in negotiations over the expansion of the Gallos racket. Joe's plan was to kill all the captives and then Profaci himself, after which he would take over the family by force. Larry's idea won, and negotiations began, leading Profaci to promise to fulfill all the demands, but only after the release of the captives. As soon as the Gallos released them, instead of fulfilling the demands, they received a death sentence from the boss. The first on the blacklist was Larry, and the hit would be carried out by the brothers' longtime criminal partner, Carmine Persico, having defected to Profaci's side. For this, he would later be nicknamed the Snake. Persico called Larry to a bar, supposedly to discuss business. The unsuspecting Larry came alone, but Persico took 2 other guys with him, one of which put a string around Larry's neck. He was saved only by a miracle. By a strange coincidence, a policeman entered the bar right then, causing the killers to flee. At about the same time, the first victim of the war appeared. Joe Jelly, a member of the Gallo crew, was killed and thrown into the sea. A box with Jelly's clothes stuffed with fish was planted at the door of the Gallo Brothers restaurant, with his finger on top of it. Right after Jelly, 2 other guys named Marco Morelli and Tony DiCarlo were killed. Then one of the Gallo's main enforcers, named Joe Maggs, was shot and killed by the bodyguard of Profaci family captain Harry Fontana. Maggs wanted to find out why Fontana, who was kind of on their side, hadn't been in touch since the assassination attempt on Larry. A conflict ensued and Maggs was killed. All of these events led to the Gallos to declare martial law on their team and lay their mattresses down in his President Street property in Brooklyn. As it happens, the main man who wanted this war practically never caught sight of it. Joe Gallo was sent to prison in December 1961. He had beat up a small businessman with the intention of entering his business as a partner. Then he tried to go over his head and take a piece of the business. The guy went to the cops, and Joe went to prison for 14 years. In prison, he became addicted to books, mastered the technique of speed reading, and absorbed them one by one. He especially liked philosophy. However, no one was going to let him just read there in peace. Profaci wanted to get Joe behind bars. Larry even warned him to never eat food brought from outside the prison walls, as there were rumors that this was how the murder would take place. Since the Gallos really made themselves outcast, having entered the war with Profaci, Joe could not hope for the support of comrades in prison, rather the opposite. So, instead of Italians, Joe found friends among the African Americans. His main comrade was Nicky Barnes, a heroin dealer that was even cooler than the more publicized Frank Lucas. There were even rumors that Joe wanted to go into business with Barnes, but it didn't happen in the end. Instead of partnering with the Gallos, Barnes went with a member of the Lucchese family sitting in the same prison, named Matthew Madonna. However, the connection with black gangsters gave Joe not only a good friend, but also problems with the Ku Klux Klan. In the prison barbershop were several chairs, some for black barbers to cut hair and some for white. Inmates of the same skin color sat in their chairs accordingly. Joe defiantly broke this rule and had his hair cut by the blacks. The Klan decided to punish him for it, but they miscalculated a bit and sent only one man. During the fight, Gallo bit off the guy's ear and ran away with him to his cell, where he stuffed the guy and all his meaning down the toilet. The Klan man, meanwhile, was yelling and calling out to the guards for help. In general, Joe's whole time in prison was spent in this way, biting off ears and talking with other prisoners about the futility of our worldly existence. He was much calmer in prison than in the streets of Brooklyn, where his brothers in blood and name continued to fight against superior forces. The Gallos numbered about 25 men, and Profaci had about 200 in his command. Learning of this conflict, the authorities surrounded the place on President Street where the Gallos were hiding with observation posts. In this way, they wanted to make it clear that they saw what was happening and would not let the neighborhood drown in blood because of gang warfare. It partly helped, but no one was going to stop the war. The Gallos turned their headquarters on President Street into a fortress, with netting on the windows and sentries on the roof. And Profaci's men, of which Carmine Persico was one of the most active, laid siege to it and tried to fish out the rebels one by one. All this went on until the spring of 1962, and active operations suddenly stopped. It was rumored that Larry had been promised the boss's spot after the death of a cancer-ridden Profaci if he would make peace with Persico and end the war. According to theory, the fathers of this idea were Lucchese and Gambino, the main forces of the commission at the time. Whether this is true or not, I can't say, as there's too little evidence. But there was indeed a truce, and the shooting did not begin again until after Profaci's death in the summer of that year, and Joe Magliocco had taken his place. The Gallos' main target was still Persico, whose betrayal they wanted to avenge. There were quite a few assassination attempts on him in 1963, almost consecutively, but he managed to survive all of them. One time, the Gallos gunman threw a grenade, but it bounced off unsuccessfully, so he decided to pick it up and throw it again, and ended up without an arm. Another time, a bomb was planted under the bottom of Persico's car, which a Gallos man detonated as soon as Carmine got behind the wheel. The car jumped upward. It landed in an impressive explosion crater, and a stunned Persico emerged from it uninjured. One explanation for this miracle I found was that the bomb was planted incorrectly, and the explosion was directed down instead of upward. Finally, the third time, his car was literally lit up by machine guns, but the bullets did not hit any vital organs. However, according to legend, one of them hit Persico in the arm and crawled up to his head until it pierced his cheek and popped into his mouth while Carmine was answering questions from the police, who were extremely surprised when he spit the bullet out into his palm and handed it to them. Others were less fortunate, however, and in 1963, the number of people killed in this war passed 24, not counting the wounded and maimed. And it's not known how long the war would have lasted had it not been for the uncovered plot of Joe Magliocco and another family boss, Joe Bonanno, who wanted to eliminate the three other bosses, Gambino, Lucchese, and Magaddino, allowing themselves to become a major force in the American Mafia. You can see more about this in my video on Joe Bonanno. However, this idea failed because Joe Columbo, who was also involved in the conspiracy, betrayed Bonanno and took everything to the commission. Magliocco was not killed, but simply forced to step aside, as he was also terminally ill. The new boss was Columbo, and he managed to negotiate with the Gallos to make peace. Columbo left the Gallos in charge of their territory, and a bit later, Larry became captain. 8 years of peace followed. The Gallos didn't touch anybody, and nobody touched them. It was in this environment that Larry lived out his final years, dying at the age of 41 from cancer. Then, in 1971, Joe was released from prison. Back when Larry was still alive, Joe Columbo had to strongly reckon with the opinions of the Gallo Brigade. Some even compared Larry's power with the power of the boss of another family. But in 1968, he was gone, and the team was headed by Albert, who recognized the supremacy of Columbo. That is, roughly speaking, when Larry was at the helm, Columbo had to negotiate with him, but under Albert, it was enough for him to just send down an order and wait for it to be done. Naturally, Joe didn't like this arrangement. When he got out, he was extremely displeased with Albert. He scolded him for bowing down and for the way he had allowed himself to be treated by Columbo. Joe was particularly pissed off when Albert gave Columbo a golf cart for Christmas, and in return, he received matching ties for the entire Gallo crew. Joe did not want to stay on such terms and called Columbo for a meeting. The same sent 2 trustees in his place who brought $1,000 for Gallo. Joe sent the money back to them and said that he was waiting for $100,000. Of course, Columbo refused, in which case Joe relayed that the boss could get lost if he wanted to, and if there was something he didn't like, the Gallos were ready for war. Back on President Street, Joe told the boys that there might be a war coming soon, and they should be ready. But Columbo let it go, seemingly deciding that it was better to leave the Gallos alone and everything would work itself out. It was the calm before the storm, broken only by minor clashes. Everyone was ready for a repeat of the 1960s war, and Joe was the only one who acted as if nothing had happened. He went around New York City at night with only a few guards or all alone, and spent his evenings in popular clubs and bars in full view of everyone, as if he hadn't told his boss to get out of town. There, by the way, he liked to hang out not only with his buddies, but also with the bohemians of the time, discussing with them the knowledge he'd acquired during his days in prison, making sure to give his opinion. Here, for example, is what the wife of actor Jerry Orbach recalled about her first encounter with Joe Gallo. He asked me whether I prefer the views of Camus or Sartre. I have to admit, I almost fell into the plate of spaghetti I was eating. I knew who he was and had not expected such a question. I replied that I was more interested in Camus, and Joe said he thought Camus was suicidal, adding that he liked people with a will to live better. When asked why Camus was suicidal, he replied that anyone who gets in a car with someone driving that fast is committing suicide. Camus, in case you didn't know, was killed in a car accident. And Joe became very close friends with the Orbach family after that evening of introductions. He later admitted to Jerry Orbach that he wanted to break his legs for the way he portrayed a character based on Joe Gallo in the movie The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. He changed his mind though, which he ultimately would not regret. And while Joe was having fun making up for lost time in prison, there was an assassination attempt on Joe Columbo. At another rally of the Italian-American League, which he supposedly created to fight for the rights of Italian Americans, he was shot by a black man. According to one version, Joe Gallo was behind it, deciding to put an end to the inevitable conflict. According to another, it was a conspiracy initiated by Carlo Gambino, because they didn't like what Columbo was doing to the Italian-American League, raising unnecessary noise around the topic of the Mafia. I'll leave a detailed breakdown of this topic for the video about Columbo, but for now I'll just say that, as for the question of whether it was Joe Gallo, it was more likely no than yes. The main arguments pointing at Joe were his conflict with Columbo and his good relationship with black gangsters. However, writer Frank DiMatteo, who was close to Gallo himself at the time and whose father was one of the gang's lead men, states that Joe had nothing to do with it. He claims that the men in the gang were extremely surprised when they learned of the hit attempt, adding that if Joe had been preparing something like this, DiMatteo's father would certainly have known and warned his son. After the assassination attempt, Columbo fell into a coma, and tensions between Gallo and the rest of the family only increased, occasionally even erupting into shootings and more attempted murders. Guess who didn't care one bit? Yes, Joe Gallo, who still continued to live life to the fullest, going out almost daily and not shy to make dark jokes about Columbo, like the one where he eats vegetables and becomes a vegetable himself. In case you don't know, Columbo spent a long time in a coma after the shooting. It was all for nothing, of course. After the assassination attempt on Columbo, the main force in the family became the Persico brothers, who had been at odds with the Gallos ever since the first war in the family. Just think of how many hit attempts on Carmine there were in total during that period. The Persicos would have taken every opportunity to get revenge, and Joe's bar hopping was clearly an opportunity for them. And that is exactly what happened. It was April 7th, 1972, Joe's 43rd birthday, which he decided to celebrate in the evening with his wife, stepdaughter, sister Carmela, and two guys from the crew, Pete the Greek with his girlfriend, and Bobby Darrow. They went to the Copacabana. There, they partied for the most part, and it wasn't until almost just before they left that Joe had a little conflict with the boss of a family from Pennsylvania named Russell Buffalino, whom he approached to say hello. Gallo saw a badge of the Italian-American League on his jacket, which Joe Columbo was involved with. Joe didn't like that organization, nor did he like anything associated with Columbo. So, in a half-joking manner, he asked Buffalino, "Do you really believe in that bullshit league?" Russell didn't answer anything and just walked away from the heavily drunk Gallo. The conversation with Joe was continued by Buffalino's man, Frank Sheeran. "Joe, you can't talk like that. He's the boss." "Me too. We're brothers. Aren't we equal?" At this point, Joe was led away to a table by his man Greek Pete. Soon, Gallo let Bobby Darrow go and left a cop with the rest of his men. On the way home, he wanted Chinese food, and they went to his favorite restaurant in Chinatown, though it turned out to be closed. Joe then called a ride down Mulberry Street to Little Italy, where they stopped by to see Genovese family capo Matthew Ianiello. And after talking to him for a while, went to a table where they continued the party. According to Frank Sheeran, what followed was that he came to this restaurant and shot Joe for insulting Buffalino. In reality, though, Sheeran had nothing to do with it. Gallo was spotted in the restaurant by Joe Luparelli, the chauffeur of then-acting Columbo family boss Joe Iacovelli of the Persico faction. Luparelli slipped out of the establishment and called Iacovelli, who ordered him to find some more guys and shoot Joe. The rest you all know from the movie The Irishman. A man walked into the restaurant and started shooting. Joe tried to run away to divert the fire from the women and child to himself, but was shot. The man got in his car and drove away. After that, everyone realized what was to happen. The Gallos team, led by Albert and the rest of the family, led into battle by Carmine's brother, Alley Boy Persico, started to prepare for war. The fighting continued with few interruptions until the fall of 1974, and the number of casualties killed and wounded was close to 24, when the commission decided to offer that Albert Gallo lay down his arms in exchange for acceptance into the Genovese family. He took the offer, and the war was ended. There was another outbreak of conflict in 1976. The initiative did not come from Gallo. This time, instead of responding, Albert filed a complaint with the Columbo family through the Genovese family bosses. The issue was addressed, and the instigators were removed. After this, the Gallo crew existed quietly within the greater Genovese family.